Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this program on gig worker rights in New York State during the pandemic and beyond. I'm Maria Figueroa, Director of Policy Research at the Worker Institute of Cornell ILR. This webinar, hosted by the Worker Institute and the Lois Gray Innovation Initiative, will examine the impact of the current crisis on workers engaged in non-standard work arrangements, such as temporary work and independent contracting. These workers are commonly known as gig workers, and because they fall in gray areas or gaps in our legal framework, they lack protections that most regular employees enjoy. Our main focus today is on the economic and public health impacts of the pandemic on gig workers, and on what policy changes are needed to address the lack of protections that these workers have experienced prior to and during the crisis. For this discussion, we have invited labor and policy experts as well as frontline worker organizers who will bring their perspectives to bear on the key issues. And we're honored to welcome Senator Robert Jackson and Senator Jessica Ramos, who will join later in the program, who have been champions of progressive policy in New York State for all workers and for gig workers in particular. Before we begin the program, I would like to introduce the Dean of the ILR School, Alex Colvin, who will offer all welcome remarks on behalf of our school. After Dean Colvin speaks, the Academic Director of the Worker Institute, Professor Eileen DeVault, will welcome participants on behalf of the Worker Institute and will introduce Senator Robert Jackson. Good afternoon, Alex, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Maria. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to thank all of my colleagues at the Worker Institute for working on putting this together. This is a really important topic. And I also want to acknowledge this is part of the Lois Gray Innovation Initiative, important program that the Worker Institute's running. And Lois Gray, our long-standing faculty member, I think would have loved to have been here to hear about exactly this kind of topic, because it's an incredibly important one for our society. Even before the pandemic, we knew that gig worker policy was a really important issue for us to confront, because it challenges many of the existing worker protections that we've developed over the years. One of the key things to understand, I think, in this area is that debates around the nature of gig work isn't just a theoretical debate about how we define employment, define work. It's a question about the rights and the protections that workers have. We know that there are workers doing this work. The question of what their status is isn't a theoretical question about status. It's a question about what protections they have, what are the best policies for those workers. This is something that the Worker Institute has been working on. It issued a report last year that some of my colleagues here co-authored, looking at this issue. It's something that we've been looking at for a while at the ILR School. One of my most recent PhD students, Michael Mathey, did his dissertation on conflict amongst rideshare drivers. This is something that at the ILR School we're very concerned about, thinking through these policy implications. Now coming to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think has intensified how we think about these concerns. We're all very aware that gig workers are doing some of the crucial tasks that is keeping our society going. Delivery workers seem a much more important part of the functioning of our society than I think we thought of before the pandemic. That's the case with many workers who I think were undervalued by our society, that we're starting to be made much more aware of their importance. We think of the grocery workers as well as obviously the healthcare workers. But gig workers have been particularly impacted by this pandemic, and we need to think about what are the right ways to protect their rights, what are the best policies for them. I'm really pleased with the panel that we've got here today. I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion, and it's really great to have Senators Jackson, Ramos, two really important New York State leaders here to be speaking to as well. So I'm really looking forward to a great discussion here today, and I'm going to turn over next to my colleague, Professor Eileen DeVault. Eileen.
Okay, thank you, Alex. It really is great to be here, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all on behalf of the Worker Institute at Cornell's ILR School. The Worker Institute runs education and training programs, provides technical assistance to unions, workers' centers, and others, and conducts policy research and public programs like this one. All of these are directed toward advancing workers' rights and collective representation. And we've been conducting research for a number of years, as Alex mentioned, on gig workers, or as our 2019 report phrased it, on-demand platform workers. Today, we're going to be looking at possible policy solutions to advance these workers' rights during this perilous time, when both workers' rights and workers' lives are in ever more danger. Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, New York State Senator Robert Jackson. Jackson was involved for years in New York City politics, on the school board, on the city council, and in other ways, long before he became senator for District 31 in Manhattan in 2018. He represents northwestern Manhattan down to parts of Chelsea. And he's the chair of the New York State Senate Committee on Cities, which seems very appropriate. He's also a long-term friend and ally of ILR and the Worker Institute, and he taught for several years in our Labor Studies Certificate program almost 20 years ago now. Last fall, Jackson sponsored legislation called Fair Play for All Workers to achieve protections for gig workers and stop the misclassification of those workers as independent contractors. So thank you very much for coming to speak to us today, Senator Jackson. We're very eager to hear what you have to tell us. Senator Jackson.
First, let me thank all of you for participating in this forum and discussion about workers, and especially workers that are misclassified, which many call them gig workers. And so I just think it's important that we all come together in order to discuss this topic and constantly refocus to do what's best overall on behalf of all workers. That's really the aim and objective of what this is about. And even though there are other pieces of legislation that may be in the state Senate or the state assembly, I think that we collectively have to say what is best for the people that we represent to ensure that they have workers' protection rights, such as if they get laid off, unemployment insurance, which is the #1 issue that is being discussed in all of the offices, not only in New York City, but I even heard down in Kentucky this morning, they have the highest unemployment insurance rate in the country. And this woman was saying that she applied early in March and has still not received a check. But besides unemployment, you talk about vacation time, sick time, health benefits, and all of the protections of an employee, and especially an organized employee, meaning union represented. So let me thank you for Maria for also being the MC this afternoon, and for the Dean and everyone else for joining us. So as we all know, the Department of Labor estimates that nearly 850,000 New Yorkers are misclassified as independent contractors rather than employees. And about 700,000 are not app-based, but in services like housekeeping, home care, home health care, child care, building services, construction, transportation, retail. And in New York City, the Department of Labor estimates 2 out of 3 are people of color. So many of my constituents, which runs from Marble Hill all the way down to Chelsea area, are having trouble accessing unemployment insurance benefits during COVID-19 because they have been misclassified as independent contractors, and pandemic unemployment insurance is even more backed up than the traditional unemployment. In fact, we had every day, the governor's office has a recapture of what the governor said. And I've been on there myself where we said, well, what about the people that have applied for unemployment and then they are denied? And then early on in the process, they said they have to reapply and then it will be considered. It came to a point where they said no, they no longer have to reapply. It would just go straight through from one to the other without being denied and reapplying. And obviously, during this pandemic, we are all trying to find the best ways to represent the people that we represent. But in addition, because so many workers are misclassified, their employers haven't been paying unemployment insurance in the first place. And just yesterday, it was announced that $7.6 billion has been paid out so far as unemployment insurance. But this is not just a workers' right issue. It is a racial justice issue and an issue of economic survival. Because many of you know my involvement in education. And I've said education is the key to uplift all families. And it doesn't matter if you're black, white, yellow, green, or blue, or whether you're rich or you're poor. Education is the key. And what I've also said is that right now, the people that are in most need, what do they want? They want food to eat and shelter over their heads and their family's head. Those are the two main things that people are focusing on right now. And that's why so many, the number one cause is about unemployment insurance and also housing, the rent laws that we're going to be acting on hopefully pretty soon in the New York State Senate. So these are the very issues of economic survival. But the bill, Expanding Workers' Dignity Act, which I share with Deborah Glick, who's an assembly member from the Lower West Side in the assembly, is a direct way to address the widespread issue of misclassification across various sectors. And as many of you know, it's about an ABC test. And many of you know what that is, but for anyone who doesn't, it means that an independent contractor can be, to be misclassified correctly, they have to meet 3 criteria. A, they're free from the control and direction of the hiring entity in order how they operate and do their job. And B, they perform services outside of the hiring entity's usual course of business. And C, they engage in an independent trade, occupation, or business that is separate from the business identity in which they're connected with. So my office and Deborah Glick's office have been working with labor leaders and workers that would be affected by this legislation for months to carefully plan and carve out that makes sense for all New York workers. And so we have followed what have happened in California. And as you know, one size do not fit all. And that's the approach that we're taking. One size does not fit all. And so I'm committed to hearing from all sides of this issue so we can make the absolute best bill possible that would do right for our workers in New York State. Doesn't matter where they live at. And so if the bill, for example, that we put together is a combination of several bills, then so be it, as long as we collectively do what's best for the people. And that's what it's about. And so that's what I'm here today in order to listen and discuss in this forum. Thank you.
Yeah, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Senator Jackson, for that information on the proposals that you're currently promoting and for your insights. We hope that you will be able to stay for as much of the program as possible so that you can participate in the discussion and the Q&A section that will follow the panel. We will now turn to our panel. We're pleased to have labor journalist Steve Greenhouse leading this discussion. We couldn't think of anybody else who would best do this work of leading and moderating the panel discussion. Steve is a retired journalist from the New York Times, but he continues to be one of the most prominent labor analysts, and he's a prolific writer on all issues affecting working class in the U.S. So at this point, I'd like to bring the attention of all attendees to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you move your browser to the bottom of the screen, you can see a feature that says Q&A. It looks like a little folder. So please click on that folder and write your questions in that section of the software, and so that I can get your questions and pass them on to Steve, who will pose them to the panelists. So with no further ado, good afternoon, Steve, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you for the nice introduction. I hope you could hear me. Thanks, Maria. It's great that Cornell Worker Institute has organized this conference webinar on such an important subject. It's an honor to be participating in something named after, inspired by Lois Gray, who is a pioneering labor educator, who is a pioneer among women in this field, and just a wonderful woman. So the issue of gig work has been important for years, and it's especially important right now during the pandemic. And we've seen far too many employers try to minimize their responsibilities toward their workers. And gig work is kind of the worst manifestation of that, where companies say, you're not an employee for us. We don't have to provide you with anything. We don't have to provide you, with minimum wage or overtime coverage. We don't have to pay anything toward your Social Security. You can't unionize because you're an independent contractor, and you can't sue us for racial discrimination or sexual harassment because you're not an employee. So unfortunately, gig work is really giving many workers the short end of the stick, but it's great for many employers who want to minimize responsibility to the workers and pass all the risks they can towards workers. And we've really seen this play out now with the pandemic. And in ways, the pandemic has hit gig workers in two very different ways. Some gig workers, like e-hailing drivers, Uber and Lyft, they've really had, their workloads cut back tremendously. Many have hardly any work to do. On the other hand, there are gig workers like, delivery folks who have more work than ever before, and they complain that they haven't been nearly protected enough. So we have an excellent panel today with 4 terrific people. Angelis Solis is an organizer with Make the Road New York. Brendan Sexton is executive director of the Independent Drivers Guild, which represents many e-hailing drivers here in New York City. Ken Jacobs is the distinguished chair of the UC Berkeley Labor Center. And then Brian Chen is a staff attorney at the National Employment Law Project. So we're going to start with Angelis. And I wanted to begin by asking you, how is the crisis affecting gig workers? What is Make the Road seeing?
Thank you, Stephen. My name is Angelis. I'm the lead organizer of the Workplace Justice Team. It's an honor to be with all of you here today. We represent a number of delivery workers across the city. We support workers in organizing their workplace, as well as land settlements with employers who break the law. As many folks here know, DoorDash, Grubhub, Uber Eats, they've been in the spotlight for their exorbitant commission fees on small businesses and employers, and that same exploitative practice is magnified or multiplied for delivery workers who largely are immigrants. Here in New York City, data shared from immigrant and delivery advocates demonstrate that nearly 90% of the workforce, the delivery workforce in New York City, are immigrant or foreign born, and almost 2/3 of those are undocumented or don't have work authorization. So as so many of our members rely on these apps for survival work, we see a number of dangerous trends that especially put them at risk before COVID and now even further. Gig or misclassified workers, they are not likely to have health insurance, right? Making them vulnerable in this crisis. They may have to pay for their own PPE, unlike the employee of another business. They're not eligible most of the time for unemployment benefits. If even now, if they have work authorization, they are, but that doesn't help the thousands who don't have work authorization and are relying on work to provide for their families. They're less likely to have savings in a time of unemployment. There is a lack of access to paid sick leave or even transparency or accountability or clear communication in navigating these systems. And there's massive job loss, making it more competitive, and meaning that essential workers are relying on informal economies or taking under the table paid work that puts them at further risk and of exploitation. So those are just a number of the issues that we're seeing right now.
So what is your terrific group, Make the Road, doing? What are its strategies to try to help gig workers, both in organizing and both in Albany and the City Council?
Of course. So I will start by saying that for a number of years, a number of allies here in this group and Make the Road led the charge for decriminalizing electric bikes, which so many app-based delivery workers rely on in order to get the job done safely. They had largely been targeted by the New York City Police Department, and on the state level, there was little relief for immigrant workers who were facing incredibly high fees for doing modifications to their bikes. But the first victory that we had during COVID was getting a temporary order of decriminalization on the city level. And then a few weeks after, Governor Cuomo did sign our e-bikes legislation into law, which will provide relief and a temporary measure of safety for delivery workers during this crisis, which honestly should have been recognized far before COVID hit. But on a direct services level, Make the Road is providing fundraising and providing economic assistance to excluded workers and their families. We are organizing with workers in their workplaces, from delivery to grocery stores to Amazon warehouses, supporting strikes, supporting petitions and actions on employers to secure PPE, hazard pay, paid childcare. And I'll say we've had a number of victories, but they are nothing close to what our communities require. And that is where we need the state to step in. So Make the Road. Can you talk a little about
your victories and what they achieved?
Sure. Well, I'm thinking about a couple restaurants where, after some strongly worded letters, some workers refusing to, practicing their right and withholding their labor, and a couple digital online campaigns, they were able to secure PPE. We also formed a mutual aid bike brigade where our delivery workers who lost work could step in and serve their community as we supported them in finding other means of employment. So some victories like that. We've also been incredibly instrumental in pushing the needle on Amazon here in New York City, involving the New York Attorney General, over 45 state electeds, to pay attention to the dangerous amount of COVID cases in warehouses that employ people from Jersey, from Bronx, from Manhattan, and all across our city, who are entering an unprotected facility and then bringing the virus back home to their communities. So our victories there have been in securing stricter social distancing measures inside of warehouses, calling on Governor Cuomo to intervene, which has not happened yet, for a shutdown, but we are getting a lot of traction from other officials in getting us there. And we've also helped secure an extended, before June, an extended timeline on unpaid time off, which would mean that the worker could choose to stay home if they risked for their safety.
Thank you, Angeles. Now I turn to Brendan. Brendan, a lot of people aren't that familiar with the Independent Drivers Guild. Can you tell us a little about it, and also tell us how e-hailing drivers have been affected by the crisis, by the pandemic? I think you have to unmute, Brendan. I'm not hearing you.
It's good?
Now it's good, yeah.
Great, thank you to everyone for setting this up. I'm really looking forward to the panel and hearing everyone's ideas. The Independent Drivers Guild, we represent over 200,000 workers in the gig economy in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. We started as an affiliate of the Machinist Union, who's been organizing black car drivers since the 90s, and had some great victories for the black car drivers. So we are an organization that is driver-led. The drivers determine our policies, our directions, and do most of the organizing. We are an advocacy group that kind of gets all of our ideas together and fight for better working conditions. We have fought for the tipping app in Uber. There was no tipping in Uber originally, and we fought and made sure that tipping was allowed in Uber. We fought for years and won minimum wage rights for New York City drivers. So all New York City drivers, all TLC drivers have a minimum wage. We have fought for and won benefits for our drivers here in New York City, and we're looking to expand that out into New Jersey and Connecticut as well. And more importantly, just right now, just to kind of touch into what we're going to is, we also have the first of its kind, a wellness program with social workers on staff that are dealing with, this tremendous fallout in the industry. Stephen, as you alluded to, the industry is bottomed out for drivers. I think it's somewhere at 90% business decline, and drivers are absolutely struggling to get through. So we have our wellness program has been inundated with calls and outreach from drivers looking for assistance in every kind. We've had thousands of drivers call our 24/7 hotline that's staffed by licensed social workers. It's staffed by driver advocates that are peer counselors. So these are drivers that have come through our wellness program and did some training, extensively trained on how to deal with mental health. So we have seen our crisis counselors taking on almost 1,000 cases for drivers. We've had hundreds of psychotherapy counseling sessions in the last few months with drivers. And then on the other end of it, we also have drivers that have been volunteering their energies to better the community. In partnership with the Black Car Fund, we have been getting PPE out to drivers at the TLC delivery site. So the TLC is hiring drivers to deliver meals to other New Yorkers, and we've distributed thousands and thousands of PPE kits to drivers. They were not being supplied by the city nor their companies, of course. I think really, what the crisis has shown us today is a difference between not having a collective voice and those that do have a collective voice. If I could take a minute just to jump back into my old UFCW days, a Trader Joe's worker on the Upper West Side has no paid time off except for what's legislated. They have no PPE, and they have absolutely no voice. But a worker in ShopRite in East New York has paid time off that's better than the legislated one. They have benefits, and they have a PPE, which their union, was able to get for them. And the big difference is that they have a collective voice and they take collective action that's funneled through a union. And I think that we can all agree that unions and unionizing is the answer. And it's just a matter of how we can get there the fastest way. Long before this pandemic, we've been advocating for the right to bargain. And we were hoping that it would get past this year, where in New York, we could have 120,000 drivers organize and collectively bargain for their benefits. I think what we need to do is figure out a path for these workers. The National Labor Relations Act, while it was a great bill in 1935, we really have to think about how we're going to address labor laws today. And working with different groups like Clean Slate, we've developed these models of how to organize workers in the gig economy.
Brendan, thanks. So the emergency coronavirus legislation, for the first time, said that gig workers can qualify for unemployment insurance. Are many of your members, are you seeing many drivers qualify for unemployment insurance? Is it not really working out very well?
Yeah, so a lot of our members are filing for it, and it is a mixed bag, as you can imagine. A brand new program being foisted on the DOLs, whether it's Connecticut, New York, or New Jersey. I know there was a lot of misinformation at the beginning of when the CARES Act was passed. So drivers are being erroneously told how to file for unemployment, and that delayed a lot of applications. We're now starting to see drivers get some unemployment insurance and the PUA insurance. So it's a mixed bag right now, but the drivers are starting to get it, and we're grateful for that.
Thank you, Brendan. So now I'm going to turn to Ken Jacobs. Ken, how are things in California? 36 million people have applied for unemployment insurance, has lost their jobs over the past 2 months. Are things even worse generally for gig workers than for traditional workers? What are you seeing overall for gig workers, Ken?
Well, I'd say overall for gig workers, we've had the driving in terms of, say, T&C drivers has fallen off by about 80% in terms of the market, in terms of transportation network companies, Uber and Lyft. We've seen some increase in the delivery services, but not near the same numbers of people. And overall, we do have the pandemic unemployment insurance, but what's really important in this context is you do not qualify for pandemic unemployment insurance if you qualify for regular unemployment insurance. And by national IRS data shows that 74% of people who work in online platforms also had W-2 jobs in that same year. So they can get regular unemployment insurance for that work, but none of their gig work counts towards their benefit level. So, and this isn't just true for online platform workers in terms of rate. If you look at all 1099 workers, about 59% have other W-2 work. So the vast majority of workers will not qualify for unemployment through PUA. And in fact, both either because of their immigration status, as mentioned earlier, or largely because they also have some amount that they may be getting from regular unemployment. But just as a note, stepping back, I mean, I think the biggest thing we've seen here is that COVID-19 laid bare the importance of each of the rights and benefits that come with employment status under the law, and that it has really changed the discussion and thinking among many gig workers themselves and among the public, that prior to this, there was a whole discussion that went, gig workers decide when they want to work or not, so unemployment isn't really relevant. Or prior to the New York TLC showing it could be done, that there was no way to enforce a minimum wage in these areas. And what we have seen is that each of the rights and benefits that come with employment has proven incredibly important during this crisis. That's unemployment insurance, that workers' compensation insurance if people get sick on the job, and creating an incentive for employers to protect people, paid sick leave, which we have a right in California and in many of our cities in terms of protecting both the drivers and the general public. And so overall, I think all of those rights and benefits that come with unemployment insurance, that come with the employee status, have really been proven necessary broadly by the COVID-19 epidemic. And that also goes to the right to bargain and to organize, where, as mentioned by the previous speaker from the IDG, just how important that is in terms of getting the protections, the health and safety protections on the job.
So Ken, many of us in New York, many people in New York look with envy at California's enacting Assembly Bill 5, which goes far to say many gig workers should be considered employees and have all the protections of regular employees, and that they're not independent contractors. So how big a difference has AB 5 had, and what can we in New York and in other states learn from AB 5?
Well, I think AB 5 makes a very big difference in making clear what the rules are for who's an employee and who's an independent contractor. Now, in the case of the online platforms, online labor platforms, both Uber and Lyft, but also the delivery services, they have still refused to comply with the law. And so last week, our Attorney General and the district attorneys of our major cities did a lawsuit on the transportation network companies over this issue. And I would really encourage everybody to read the lawsuit. It's a beautifully written piece that goes through in sort of just point after point, very clear, concise, and devastating on why workers are and should have been considered employees. And to note, this goes back farther than just the passage of AB 5. Their suits going back 3 years. We had cases where our Department of Labor Standards Enforcement ruled that drivers were eligible for unemployment insurance going back to 2015. Wow. And I think that brings up one of the real important issues just around AB 5 overall, is there's been a lot of questions about, in a number of different areas, about its application, going beyond the drivers and thinking about, it's come up big with arts workers and writers and yoga instructors and some other areas, is that when we look at it closely, most of the workers who are affected by it, where the cases have been come up, would have been considered employees under the Borello test had there been misclassification suits and had it been raised. And that what AB 5 did was more than change the law, is it made it hard, very difficult to ignore the law. And so I think that is the big sort of change that we are seeing in California. And just a final note, the gig companies have put a ballot initiative on in California for November that would carve the transportation network and delivery services out of the law, revert them back to being independent contractors under the law, and take away the rights that they have gained.
Last question, Ken. So what additional federal response, what do you think the federal government can do, should do, in addition to help gig workers?
Well, the federal government should do an AB 5 law, not happening under this administration, to clarify employment status all the way across the board. And of course, there are proposals to do that. But some additional assistance and benefits are going to be needed through this period that go beyond employment status. And I think that, so the PUA was important. I think the restrictions on having it, that you can only get one or the other, that makes sense for the extra $600, but for the benefit base is a real problem, just because there's such a tremendous overlap. So that's something that could be fixed in the short run on the federal level. But ultimately, we need to deal with this issue of misclassification.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Now we turn to Brian Chen. Brian, thanks for your patience, sir. We've seen a lot of problems for gig workers, mistreatment of gig workers. Can you discuss how gig workers have reacted collectively and generally to what's happened to them during this pandemic?
I think we've been seeing an incredible amount of organizing and people who are starting to assert their rights under the law and to say that, we are very oftentimes employees under the law, and that we need to make it clear to access our labor rights. There's just an incredible amount of worker organizing. And I think what is exciting to me is that, for the longest time, these gig employers or platform employers, they have really been able to misclassify largely because they have invented this fiction where their workers are independent contractors and they're their own boss. The employers love the idea of independence and flexibility for their workers. And especially now during COVID, so many of these platform workers are seeing how hollow that vision of flexibility really is. And they're starting to organize themselves beyond just accepting what a company calls flexibility, and actually is starting to assert their rights.
And what do you think should be done at the state level and even on the city level to help gig workers and give them more rights, and perhaps give them more rights to act collectively?
It's important. It's really important here in New York. So, at NELP, we've been involved in both city and state legislation. So at the city level, the New York City Council is considering an essential worker bill of rights that would do a number of things that would really help people who are on the front lines. It would include premium pay for essential workers, just cause protection from arbitrary firings, and paid sick leave for misclassified workers, including gig workers. So a lot of those things will go a long way towards helping people out. And of course, cities can and should be raising standards as much as they can, but ultimately it is not the local municipalities who write the labor laws, but it's the legislatures at the state and federal level who do. So it really is critical to get it right at the state level. And I think of it really in terms of the difference between charity and justice. And charity is recognizing a problem and doing something. So we can all recognize that gig workers and people who deliver your meals are underpaid, and we can tip them generously, and that's good, but that isn't actually getting to the question of why is something happening and how can I change it? And so we have to ask really, why are gig workers and other people who are struggling, why is it that they're struggling? And how can we change it? And that comes down to the fact that we have these labor laws that can be gamed by employers. It allows them to misclassify their workers and to deny their workers the full set of rights and protections. And it ultimately allows these companies, very often very powerful, very wealthy companies, to reap all the material benefits of their workers' labor without meeting even a baseline standard of employer obligations. And so states desperately need to be acting to address worker misclassification and this problem of a two-tier or a fissured workplace where so many people have been dispossessed of their labor protections under the law. And so certainly here in New York, our coalition has been advocating for an ABC test that is already used in New York in construction and commercial trucking, industries that have a lot of misclassification, and to take what the legislation does in those industries, which is that they flip the presumption of employment. That's what the ABC test does. It essentially just flips the presumption. And if an employer wants to say that you're an independent contractor, that they have to meet 3 specific factors. And I think that will go a real long way to ensuring that these workers who really are among the lowest paid and with the least financial security can actually get a baseline of stability and security, and eventually, of course, a pathway to win a union so that they can have a greater say at their workplace.
Thanks. So one more question. Perhaps Senator Jackson can answer this better than anyone, but I guess I'm a bit surprised that a law like AB 5 was first passed in California, which is the home of Uber and Lyft and so many other, platform companies. Why didn't New York beat California in passing a law like AB 5 to protect gig workers? What has held up things in New York? And despite Senator Jackson's heroic efforts.
Well, I think that I will say that that's the billion-dollar question. But obviously, if you know New York State basically just last year, we now have a Democratic-led state Senate, and you've had for years a Democratic-led state assembly. But as we all know, we have a governor that's a Democrat that it takes 3 to dance in New York State, 3 leaders. And it seems as though that the biggest dancer in the dance hall doesn't want to dance. But I say that to you though, but that's where I feel, and we all feel, that we need to continue to push legislation forward. We need to continue to put pressure on all partners in this dance in order to do the right thing. But let me turn to my colleague Jessica Ramos, state senator from Queens, to jump in on that, if you don't mind. Jessica is right there.
Hey,
Go ahead,
everyone.
Jessica.
Maria, are we jumping the
Robert, how are
gun
you?
because Jessica's supposed to speak at?
I know, but just let her jump in on that.
You add your wisdom on this too.
Mm-hmm. Look,
Thanks
I
for
think
joining
that
us.
out of the gate, yeah, no, it's an honor to be here with you, Mr. Greenhouse. I've been a huge fan for a long time. I actually worked in the labor movement and in labor communications specifically for about a decade before I left to go to government. So I've been a fan for a very long time. Look, I think that out of the gate, AB 5 in California, with all of the litigation as a result, it has been hard for us in our state house to get the votes that we need, the support that we need, given the moneyed interests opposition in practice. We saw many acts bring in workers themselves telling their stories, just like we heard from a lot of gig workers from themselves without their employer's knowledge too. And I think we're trying to figure out a way in which we can improve their rights, even if it's incremental, of course. So while we fight for an AB 5-like measure, and this is what I would like to talk about later on, was to talk about what I think are the priorities for gig workers right now, which I think have only been exacerbated by the current pandemic.
Thank you. Maria, so it's 12:50 and I'm supposed to take Q&A and discussion with the audience. I don't know, I mean, there are a lot of Q&A questions. I haven't had time to look at them. Maybe there are ones that you want to read and ask the participants.
Yeah, we have great questions. I suggest we start with a question from Niels Van Doorn. He's asking whether the problem is really the lack of protections and very low standards for all workers, in particular, and immigrant workers. So the question is, shouldn't we rather put our efforts into improving pay, benefit eligibility, and working conditions across low-wage labor markets? By doing so, you create viable alternatives for immigrant workers who now find themselves between a rock and a hard place. Yeah, so in some, is the gig economy really the main problem here? Shouldn't we focus on raising standards for everybody?
Who wants to answer?
I mean, I see it as a continuous process with respects to, because these are workers that have no protection. If they get sick, they don't have health insurance, they don't have sick leave, they don't have any benefits whatsoever. If an independent contractor falls and breaks their leg and they are a delivery worker on a bike, they can't ride the bike to deliver. Or if they're in a car accident, they go and they're hospitalized, they can't. So I think that it's every industry that we must make sure that the standards that employees work in are acceptable. And that's why you have the New York State Department of Labor as far as standards that have to be met as far as conditions, as far as light, as far as seating, as far as the air you breathe, and all of these things are part of raising the standards for all people. And that's what it's about. And even if you take a look at the meat markets that have been closed around the country because the safety standards were not being met. And now that's being implemented in order to try to protect the workers. And so that's what we have to do. We have to speak on it. And that's why organizing is very important in the process, in my opinion.
Ken, do you want to say something?
Yeah, if I can add to that. I think there's an important point here in the sense that we know labor platform workers account for 2% of the overall workforce. Gig workers overall, more broadly, it's a little bit bigger than that. But most low-wage workers who are highly exploited are employees and have employee status. So we need to do both. We need to both raise the standards across the board and not forget that and really deal with the conditions of low-wage work in our communities. And that's happening when people are going into those Amazon warehouses and the organizing that's happening there right now. Those workers have employee status. They're terrible jobs, and those workers need to organize and change that. And people who are gig workers and don't even have the basic rights need to have those basic rights. And across the board, the key is, the central part of this is the ability to organize and bargain collectively and build real power and have a union. And that's going to change both real on the ground worker organizing that's going to be needed to get there, and a change in our labor laws that make that very difficult right now. So we have to do both.
Thank you. There's a question from John Russo, the retired former head of the Center for Working Class Studies at Youngstown State University. And Professor Russo says, you have provided good information on what is being done in large metropolitan areas along the coasts, but not much has been said of the gig work happening in the Midwest, and especially in former industrialized areas where gig work is expanding. Is this a question of scale and regional divides? Can you provide some information and examples? I guess what Professor Russo really wants is, we've mainly discussed gig work just in the service sector context. Do you see it rising in the industrial context? How big a problem is that? And are the solutions for that perhaps different from gig work in the service sector? Ken, Brendan, Brian, anyone? Angeles?
Well, I may say that I see this, that the advocates and the organizers have to follow the same path that California did. That's why in New York, that's why we filed bills regarding the ABC test. And I remember my involvement in education with Michael Rebell. We filed a lawsuit and sued the state of New York. But Michael Rebell, with the Campaign for Educational Equity, he follows, at Teachers College, they follow all the fiscal equity cases around the country in order to guide people where they have to actually file lawsuits and have the information. And so, as the professor said, in New York, along the coast, things are happening, but not inside the interior of the country. I think that's the type of stuff that has to be done, and following the same track. And as what Ken said, we need an AB5 at the national level, but people need to file actions locally, and it takes time. It's not like that. The lawsuit that I was involved with, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, took 13 years of litigation, where we went to the highest court in New York State on 3 different occasions. And sometimes we have to go to distance if in fact we're being denied our rights. And so that's what we have to do in from an interior point of view, in my opinion.
Anyone else want to add to
Yeah,
the answer?
I'll jump in. So I think the question is a good one, right? How do we address the middle of the country? If we're just dealing on the coast, and I think Ken had said it, right? Just modeling out new types of legislation. We can't rely on the federal government for this. I was a young union organizer in 2008, hoping that the Employee Free Choice Act was going to pass, and it really never materialized. So I think we have to look at a state action around the country. It'll be the antithesis to right to work if we have right to bargain legislation. It'll give clear, quick paths to organizing, based on the national labor relations model. But states can fine tune it for their economies. They could fine tune it for the workers. And the quicker, Ken had mentioned, are these low wage jobs, they're employee status, and they're still bad jobs. And I wish it was easy to organize W-2 employees. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. It's incredibly difficult because the federal labor laws are slanted in favor of corporations. They are not protective of workers, and companies spend millions of dollars on anti-union campaigns, and they can get away with it. So if we can write our own legislation, if we can have a clean slate, and design a way for workers to organize quickly and have collective action and collective voices, and expand it out to sectorial bargaining, workers will have a lot more power and control over their working conditions.
Thank you. Mark Ehrlich has a good question. What is the future of gig employment? As the economy reopens, will rideshare demand return? Will it grow again, or will there be a parallel decline in delivery services? And with so many, lawmakers concerned about how gig workers are being abused, might there be some important laws in some or many of the 50 states that make it harder to, for employers to hire gig workers the way they have? So, and I address this to Ken Jacobs, since you're the academic here. What would you say is the future of gig employment post-pandemic?
I think it's a really good question, and one that we've been trying to think about a lot here, because on the one hand, this recession is likely to go on for a while. I think we're unlikely to sort of see a quick bounce back. And I think it'll be a while before people are comfortable getting back in to, in terms of driving in the way that they had been in the past. I think we're going to see more of a move towards telecommuting that's going to continue after the pandemic, which means less of a need. On the other side, I think one of the real dangers here is what happens with public transportation. And to the degree that people are just very worried about getting in a subway and getting in a bus, that could push more people into rideshare services in the future. And I think that the trend to delivery services, and right now we're seeing, in groceries, the growth of grocery delivery has been very, very sharp. And there's a question of, after the recession, do people go back to their old habits, or they say, hey, I kind of like having my groceries delivered? So we could see out of this some real growth in the sectors right now that are in these labor platforms. And then that does push, Stephen, where you were going, which is the question of, okay, then does that create the pressure, the momentum to do what's necessary to regulate that sector, both in general in terms of employment rights, but also in the questions Brendan was raising around, do we then go on a state level and look at means to provide workers the right to organize, where they are not protected by federal law.
Can I just add 2 cents on that, if you don't mind, Stephen?
Fine, yes. We'll take 3 cents even.
While he was talking about down the road, let me just say what's imperative. If we, as voters in the United States of America, do not get rid of this administration, and knowing how many judges have to be appointed at every level, at the federal level, then we're in for a long haul. And that's my opinion, obviously, and I know that millions of people feel the same way with our president putting federal judges in there that are very conservative. That's not in the best interest of workers that we're fighting for, in my opinion.
Thank you.
And Steve, if I could just jump in for a sec on what the future looks like, and I'm going to be very kind of New York City specific, and we play this out in Connecticut and New Jersey as well. We've been working with the NYU School of Public Health and industrial hygienists on figuring out what a safety certified driver would look like to help build confidence back into the market for drivers and for consumers. Essential workers have to get around, and as we open up the society, they're not going to, we shouldn't have them on crowded subways, nursing home aides, home healthcare workers. Then eventually, when I apologize for any of the lawyers, but when a Fifth Avenue lawyer is ready to return to work, he or she may not be wanting to take a train to their office. So we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for our drivers to get work, that they're certified, they're making sure that the vehicles are clean, they're being safe, and giving confidence to the consumer that the car that they're getting into has a certified safety driver in it.
Thank you. A question from
Stephen, I'll actually just add on the question of what is in the future of the gig economy. I'll just add that the gig economy is a term that we should not necessarily accept as a given. I mean, we often kind of think of it as Uber and transportation and delivery services, and that's like the way we think of it just popularly. But gig economy really doesn't mean anything more than just a different and app-oriented way of mediating these labor relations, inevitably to just reduce standards across the board. And so there always will be a need for transportation. There always will be a need for delivery and personal services. But in terms of what is the future of the gig economy, I mean, hopefully what that will entail is figuring out a way to regulate that pulling down of standards so that we can hold on to a baseline of employment rights and build them up. And of course, those needs for transportation, those needs for delivery services will still remain.
That's fair. As much as we might not love the phrase gig economy, it's certainly much better than the sharing economy, in my humble opinion. A question from Allison Greenlee. She says she's an Cornell ILR grad. She writes, what I am hearing from the panelists today are references to employment status, minimum wage, but nothing in the magnitude of what is needed for our communities. If unionization is the avenue forward, what are the large-scale ways in which workers' collective power can and will be reimagined for the current movement? I imagine many of you have thoughts about this, but let's, if it's okay, Angelis, can we start with you, since your group does a lot of collective action?
It's a really good question. And it's such an important question now under our current federal administration, right? That's taking every effort that they can to dismantle unions, to roll back the protections we've fought for decades. At the same time, especially during this pandemic, not just in the States, but around the world, we're seeing workers in telecommunications, in healthcare settings, in warehouse settings, organize and strike around their rights. And there's a lot of really powerful grassroots organizing happening right now that is both bolstered by union support and is also happening without union support, which like Allison, I believe, or like this individual said, is going back to where we started. I'm thinking about game tech workers right now. I'm thinking about the grassroots organizing of Amazon and Instacart workers. Thankfully, there is still able to be a mail-in ballot elections during the pandemic, so that is an option for workers seeking to unionize. But there's a challenge here, and there's an optimistic highlight, right? The challenge is that when we return to, honestly, I hope we don't return to normal. Jessica Ramos also said this on a call this morning, but our previous workforce was not as strong as it needs to be for all of the workers in New York State, right? Like, we already see wage theft and abuse and exploitation on a daily basis, and we need better. We're demanding better. However, we understand that when we come back, employer lawyers are already organizing around forced arbitration. They're finding ways to reduce costs for when workers go back and the economy reopens. They are educating each other on how to implement contracts and agreements in really insidious and dangerous ways to get workers to sign away their rights and unintentionally sign waivers for class and collective actions. So we have to be ready for that, and we're educating workers on the communications that employers send during this time, especially to misclassified workers who are especially vulnerable to forced arbitration. So that is just one area of where we need to be on the proactive, on the offense, right? And organizing for workers for what's to come when we go back to work. And as far as long-term power, I would say even our most traditional labor allies, as a former union organizer, now at a community organization, I think there's a lot to learn from strategies that have worked in the past and the digital organizing strategies that workers are taking advantage of now, and that we can be more creative about building sectoral power around sectoral bargaining, and we can think outside of the box around building regional power. I'm thinking especially about Amazon warehouses in the New Jersey corridor. It's a good question. I don't think that we have found the roadmap there yet, but I think we're building it.
Brendan, Brian, you want to add anything?
Thanks. So yeah, I think that the key term here is reimagine. When the National Labor Relations Act was passed, it was because there was something really terrible happening in America in the factories, in the industrial, cities and towns across America, and it was a fix to what those problems were. Today, we have that same opportunity to reimagine or recreate labor laws that are going to empower workers, and through collective action, through organizing quickly, through getting to the table to negotiate and bargain with their employers, to make sure that they are defining their industry and no one else is defining it. To make sure that technology changes rapidly, incredibly fast. We saw our victory with the minimum wage here in New York City for the drivers be undermined within 2 months by the app companies, by them locking out drivers. In a collective bargaining agreement, there's no way that they would be able to do that. So I think just kind of really letting go of what worked in the past and recognizing that we need new models of organizing and we need laws. We're advocating for state laws that are going to empower workers and not corporations. We need to get corporations to the table to collectively bargain, but it's the workers that are going to do it.
Thank you.
And I quite agree with the question. In some ways, employee status is not at the magnitude of what's needed for our communities, but having a W-2 employment status does not mean everyone is necessarily happy at their workplace. I mean, there are plenty of people who are employees who face difficult and unfair conditions at their workplace, but it at least means that they have a baseline of standards, and if they have a union, that they're able to bargain up from that. And as much as unionization, I agree, is the avenue forward, if we don't have those baseline standards, bargaining from the basement is not really the same as bargaining from an equal playing field.
If I can throw in two things that states should be thinking about right now in this process, as we're going back towards go from relief to recovery. One is, Brendan mentioned, and several others, sectoral I think Annalise as well, sectoral bargaining. We should have industry councils deciding what the rules are for sectors to open back up, and those industry councils should have representations of unions and worker organizations. That's something states could be doing right now. The second, which Nelson Lichtenstein has raised and others, is we should be requiring health and safety committees in all workplaces that are essential workplaces or that are being reopened. And those health and safety committees should be given real power in terms of making decisions on what's happening in any process that affects potential exposure. So I think that there are things we could be doing in this moment of COVID-19 that help pave that way and create some of that organizing basis, but they're absolutely necessary for reopening in a safe way.
Senator Jackson, you wanted to say something, I believe? You were moving your hands. I thought that meant, okay. Okay, question.
That was agreeing with
okay, thanks. Okay.
As far as the health and safety committees and organizing. And obviously, you know, you have the New York City Central Labor Council, you have the state AFL-CIO, and you have a lot of traditional workers that have benefited from unions and organizing. They need to be part of that coalition for the workers that are undocumented, those that are struggling to survive and don't have any union protection. That's extremely important in the process overall. I clearly say that. And when someone was mentioning earlier, I thought about the airport workers and the organizing that happened around the JFK. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that was a lot of people, but I remember very clearly 32BJ with Hector Figueroa. So that's the type of grassroots unions coming in and helping others to be uplifted as far as benefits and a job and health and safety. And that's the type of stuff that we have to have.
Thank you. So there's a question from Sally Schoen. Is there a successful labor model that balances worker rights, including a livable wage, while also affording companies the flexibility of a variable workforce that independent contractors provide?
I'd like to also join that question with the previous one from Josh Idelson. He's asking, should the standard for employee status in New York include any form of carve-out for companies that participate in some form of negotiations or sectoral bargaining with workers that they are classified as contractors? So these two questions are kind of related.
So I'll answer that, the first one from Sally, in the sense that I think the answer to that question is employment status. That there is nothing in employment status that stops flexibility of a variable workforce. In fact, if we look at there was a recent analysis of national IRS data on 1099 workers, and it turns out that only 25%, about a quarter of workers with 1099s worked for more than one company that issued the 1099, only a quarter, which was much smaller than the share of W-2 workers that worked for more than one company that gave them W-2s. That is, there is nothing in the employment relationship that doesn't allow for a variable workforce. And in fact, retail is highly variable and employers learn how to do that kind of scheduling. So I think there's been this dichotomy set up that isn't necessary to the work. Now you can look at, there are certain things in areas of work where you say, well, there is flexibility in terms of how long people get the work done or how it's actually carried out. And in some of the professional areas, and you could say, okay, maybe for, you know, doctors and real estate agents, and California did that. So, all right, that is a very different work arrangement. But again, there's nothing in those W-2 relationships that doesn't allow for that variability. What we've seen is that's used as a way to do that while also avoiding all of the rights and responsibilities that come along with being an employer. In terms of Josh's question, I guess I'll leave that to the New Yorkers to discuss. But I think just note that there is a way. You know, they've looked at in Seattle, there was an attempt to create collective bargaining for, in that case, it was transportation network company drivers, ride-sharing drivers. The courts ruled that Seattle could not do that on its own because of antitrust issues, but it could be something that could be done at a state level. And so there is potentially an option, potentially an option for a way to create collective bargaining at the state level for some sets of workers. But I would argue that you could do that and still maintain the state required rights and benefits of employment. I don't know that those two necessarily need to be completely distinct.
Thank you.
Hey, Maria,
Yeah,
go ahead. Brendan, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in on this question. It's a really good point about the Seattle case. And the reason why states can do this is because the Trump NLRB has already ruled that Uber and Lyft drivers are independent contractors. So state employee status does not give them federal rights to unionize organize under a union. So what the right to bargain would do is it would address the antitrust issues through the Sherman Act, allowing these workers to collectively negotiate and bargain for wages and benefits and working conditions, but it would have to be state sanctioned, similar to gas companies who have to go to the state to set rates. So there's two big things hanging out here. The NLRB, which is already gone because they're ruled as independent contractors, and the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is the state is taking action for the betterment of the community, they can do that. And they have to show reason to do it, and they have to be an active participant and an ongoing participant in that. So, the way we imagine it is that workers would collectively bargain. They get a contract. They go to the state, a state entity, and say, "Hey, here's our collective bargaining agreement. This is how it gets laid out," and the state would sanction that collective bargaining agreement. Or if not, they would send it back and say, "This is what you have to fix." And as far as the employee rights, yeah, the way we envision this is that the workers will have the decision throughout the entire process. So if right to bargain passes, the workers would decide if they want to organize. If they don't, they would stay at employee status. If they decide that they do want to organize and they gather enough cards and they get to the table and they negotiate a contract before it goes to the state, the workers will then have the decision to vote on that contract if they like it or not. And if they don't like it, they will go back down to employee status. But the path and the power has to be with the workers. It can't be a top-down situation. It's got to be a bottom-up. It's the only way that we're going to create real worker power and be able to move to sectorial bargaining, where the workers will have more control and power over their conditions.
Maria, just a quick note, and I know that we're getting close to where Jessica's coming on, but earlier in my introduction, I said that this is not one size fits all. And so when you're dealing with, as I said, what is the primary goal and objective for all of the workers and the people that we're talking about? And so that's where adjustments have to be made, and you have to be open to discuss those. I just say that loud and clear.
Thank you, panelists. So Maria, I will turn the floor over to you, and you could introduce Senator Ramos. Thank you all for a very good discussion.
Thank you, Steve, and all the panelists for this great discussion. And yes, I would now like to introduce Senator Jessica Ramos, who will offer the concluding remarks for the program. Senator Ramos is the chair of the Senate's Committee on Labor, and she represents District 13, which includes the areas of Corona, Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, parts of Astoria. And all of these areas are in Queens, and they were at the epicenter of the pandemic in the US. As she mentioned, she comes from the labor movement, and she's now a champion for progressive labor policy in Albany. So good afternoon, Senator Ramos. We're honored that you joined us.
Thank you, Maria. ¿Cómo estás? Hi, everyone. It's really good to see everyone. Really important that we're having this critical conversation right now. Like Maria mentioned, I have the distinct responsibility of being the chair of the Labor Committee, responsibility I take very seriously, and especially given the time that we are all experiencing together. I agree with my colleague, Robert Jackson, when he says that there is not a one-size-fits-all model. In fact, when we begin to think about and define what the gig economy is and isn't, we really are talking about a vast array of different types of workers, yes, including those who work for apps, or as the governor likes to call our workers of the digital marketplace, including Uber and Lyft drivers. But of course, then there are more traditional freelancers like graphic designers. There are musicians, of course. There are sex workers, and there are essential workers like delivery workers. These are all different types of quote unquote gig economy workers who are untraditional employees and are therefore not privy to many of the same protections that the traditional New York worker is afforded. And I mention this because just last year, I was able to pass the Farm Worker Fair Labor Practices Act, which managed to grant farm workers, after decades of fighting, with the right to collectively bargain, the right to a day off, the right to unemployment and disability insurance, in addition to a few other things. And you may be thinking, why am I talking about farming when we're talking about these state-of-the-art technology? But it is actually many of those very same protections that I believe are our responsibility as lawmakers in the New York State Legislature. Right now, there are way too many workers who don't have occupational health insurance, who don't have access to workman's comp, or unemployment or disability insurance, much less things like paid vacations, right? And so earlier this year, actually, during this session, we did have time to hold one hearing having to do with the gig economy and digital marketplace workers, especially because it pertained to the budget. And we were considering what the governor had proposed in the executive budget to create a digital marketplace task force, which I jokingly but very seriously called a farce, because he wanted to build a board entirely of people, of course, who he mostly nominates and will more than likely, in our experience, be the CEOs of the companies, where the voices won't necessarily be balanced by representation from the actual workers, most especially in a currently or unorganized workforce. And so we held a hearing, and during that hearing, I remember talking to one of the workers who testified. He works for DoorDash, and I would ask, you know, you go into the restaurant, you're picking up the food that you're going to deliver, but nobody cleaned a spill. You slip and you fall in the restaurant. What happens to you? And he didn't really have an answer. I asked him, you know, you're driving the same bag of food to the address that you've been assigned, and you get into a car crash. Who covers you? Is why are you paying for your car insurance, or is DoorDash helping you cover the expense of your car insurance, since it is your work tool? And this is a very similar approach that I've taken to even thinking about e-bikes, and why it was so important for us to legalize e-bikes for delivery workers, because it's such a critical tool for their work. And so this is all to say that as we think about sectoral bargaining, because I too am a member of the same school of thought, where what we're doing really is not even talking about the sharing economy, but I think we are building an economy based on the experience of the consumer, how lazy that consumer is, how beautiful that consumer wants to consider their aesthetic. Though that is where we're moving towards, and the only real answer is for us to talk about workers as an industry wide entity. And so that is something that I'm more than happy to explore and have begun exploring actually with some folks. I also wanted to share then because we are during the pandemic, and I imagine we do have some workers listening in or watching us right now, some things that we want to be able to do right now. First off is, a lot of people don't know that the governor has a 2% spending cap on state agencies. And this is a very big problem because it has not allowed the Department of Labor to really have the capacity that is needed to address the overwhelming claims for unemployment and PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, that helps so many working families. And so while we continue to fight for that, there are actually 3 bills that I feel would help some, if not, likely not all workers, but some workers, which would be to extend the definition of who is an essential worker. We've learned during this pandemic that essential workers, like I mentioned before, includes delivery workers, includes Uber and Lyft drivers, and so they should be privy to the same benefits that the current definition includes, which means prioritized medical attention and prioritized childcare as 2 very simple benefits. And the other thing is, and largely to Angeles Solis's point from Make the Road, she's been doing amazing work with me around Amazon, because I do have an Amazon warehouse in my district where actually we saw one of the first workers get infected with COVID. It gave us the idea for a bill that mandates that employers have to notify workers in writing, in their native language, that someone on the job has gotten sick. Because that way you know how to take the proper precautions, you know what to expect, you can keep yourself safe. And which brings me to another bill that I have with Senator Hoylman that makes sure that workers aren't penalized and aren't eligible for unemployment insurance if they decide that they're not safe at their workplace. Because ultimately, and this is my last bill that I'll talk about for this session anyway, I promise, is that COVID really is becoming an occupational disease. And I represent thousands of people who are Tibetan refugees in my district, many of whom are Uber and Lyft drivers, among other apps. And it's been really interesting to see how the virus has taken a toll, given simply what most of them do for a living, and how exposed they are, therefore, as a community to a virus when they're essential workers themselves. And so I guess I want to conclude this by thanking all of you for granting me the time to explain where I am. And I very much look forward to exploring new, bold, out-of-the-box ideas so that we can continue to grow our labor movement, because I do always say unwaveringly that my purpose and my mission as chair of the New York State Labor Committee is to grow the labor movement and make sure that the New York workers' voice is heard, respected, and codified by law. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Ramos. We are so glad that you are where you are at and that you are thinking of bold and innovative ways to make the world a better place for workers. So thanks for your work. Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Cook. I'm an associate at the Worker Institute, and I want to close this thoughtful webinar by thanking all of our guests who came today to speak and to moderate and to share with us. I want to thank our team here at Cornell and all of you, the audience, for coming to this discussion, because it's such a timely and critical issue. As you heard earlier, though, I also want to celebrate with you that this is the first event of the Lois Gray Innovation Initiative, which Steve's a big fan of Lois. Thank you, Steve. Those of you who are close to the Worker Institute probably knew Lois well as a pioneer, a founder, a brilliant educator, and a mentor to many of us. When she passed last year, she wanted us to carry on the innovative work that she had championed for nearly 70 years. here at the ILR school, and that's what we intend to do. So we have a number of exciting cutting edge topical events coming up this year, a climate jobs summit September 12th, and an international conference on app-based worker organizing November 11th. We hope you'll join us for those events. And thanks again, all of you, for being with us today.